This is a video about how to interpret PSA after radical prostatectomy. So this is a graph of PSA with time. And let's say this arrow here is the moment when you had your prostatectomy. So a man's PSA is elevated before surgery, and what should happen is after surgery, it should drop down to zero or near zero, because there's only two things that make PSA: the prostate, which is out, and importantly, prostate cancer cells. So if there's no prostate or no prostate cancer cells, this is what should happen. Now, there's a couple alternatives. What if it drops down not to zero? That's a potential issue. That might be a scenario where radiation is suggested, or there can be a scenario where it drops down to zero for a period of time and then subsequently rises. In that kind of scenario, it's because we were initially fooled. There were, in fact, prostate cancer cells lurking somewhere, too small to make PSA, and we give them enough time, they start to grow and divide, and they make PSA, so that we're alerted to it later on. This is the general picture. Now, the point of confusion is this muddy area down here where we may be confused or not sure how to interpret these low values. Okay, and there's two different types of PSA checks. You can get a regular PSA, which has a threshold of 0.1, which is the lowest level that can be detected. Or sometimes the doctors can get an ultra-sensitive PSA, and the threshold varies, but whatever it is, it's going to go out to 2 decimal places. So something like 0.02. And that's what we can look at in this graph over here. So the big picture is, if the PSA drops down and then rises at some point, we define a recurrence once it crosses 0.2. That's the technical definition for when patients considered to have prostate cancer that came back. Okay, and that's when additional treatment like radiation might be recommended. But sometimes we don't wait for that. If there's strong evidence that there's a real trend, we might advise radiation before it hits 0.2. And when we find that out will depend on the kind of PSA test that the urologist orders. And I'm not going to talk about whether one is better than the other. I'm just going to simply explain it. So a regular PSA test, the threshold is 0.1, which means anything under 0.1, we'd be kind of blind to it. Any PSA value that comes back under that line, the report would simply read less than 0.1. And the less than sign is important, because if the report says 0.1, then that's an actual measurement of a PSA value that is right here on that line. Okay? Let's just make that black so it's easier to see. So a PSA that comes back right there is going to be reported as 0.1. PSA that comes back here is going to be reported as 0.2. A PSA anywhere down here will be reported as less than 0.1. Now, what about the ultrasensitive? Let's say the doctor gets an ultrasensitive, and it depends on the lab, but it might be reported as less than 0.02, or some labs are really sensitive, less than 0.006. But let's take the less than 0.02, for example. That means that the PSA blood test is truly under that 0.2 line. You see that here? So any PSA blood test that comes out less than 0.02 is going to be somewhere down there. It might actually truly be 0. We don't know. If an ultrasensitive PSA, we are blind to anything below whatever the threshold is. So if the threshold is 0.02, we won't know about anything below it, but we'll assume that it's 0. If we get a test result that is actually, let's say, 0.05, for argument's sake, then that blood test will be reported as 0.05, actually measuring it right here. If the blood test came back and it was, let's say, here, that'd be reported as 0.09. Again, anything down below that would be less than 0.02. So to summarize, there's a threshold for the lowest PSA that can be detected depending on the test your doctor orders. For a regular PSA, it's going to be 0.1. Or in some labs, it'll be slightly different. For an ultrasensitive, it'll be some low number, like 0.02 for example. You should always look for the less than sign, which is telling you that it's below the designated threshold. So if your doctor orders regular PSA, less than means it's somewhere down in this territory. If your doctor orders ultrasensitive and the result is less than, it'll be somewhere under whatever the threshold is. I hope that is helpful to you and clarifies things.